Alrighty, hey y'all, I am tuning in for my third and final podcast to give you my final thoughts on The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And the first thing I wanted to address is I kind of got into the last leg of this book, is how, and I believe I said this in my second podcast, is how present loss is a theme throughout the story. Not necessarily a theme, but an element. Throughout, Brian just portrays a visceral sense of loss, whether it be his innocence or his comrades on the battlefield, his loss of, some sort of peace, a loss of himself in Vietnam. Loss is everywhere, and it weighs incredibly heavy. It is a massive burden, and in my last podcast, I described how Brian showed how some of his squad mates, they couldn't take the loss. They either killed themselves, they had a nervous breakdown. But he combats it. And how he combats it is through telling stories. And as we come into the closing portion of this book, his stories are very, very personal. He moves away from Vietnam. And the last thing that he really focuses on in the story is the story of his first, he calls her his first love, although they were both 9. He says that he knows that even though they were children, he knows in his heart that was his first love, and he would want to spend the rest of his life together with her. He describes going on essentially a movie date with a fellow classmate named Linda, where they, it's all the hallmarks of a cheesy teen movie, except they're 9. They don't make eye contact. They hardly want to talk to each other. They're nervous, but it's good nervousness. You can sense the chemistry. Brian makes it very clear that it's a good chemistry. And throughout the story, he kind of foreshadows what happens later, but Linda has a very big, he describes it as a hat, but then he says it's a stocking cap. And he thinks it's really funny, or he thinks it's a neat looking hat, and he says, boy, that hat. And his mom gives him just a withering, acidic look. And he doesn't know why. He says, and it comes in later, or I thought that once I didn't understand it when I first read it. I thought it was just different sensibilities of the time. But as you progress, you understand why the mom reacted like this. He says that she looked at him like he had uncovered some terrible secret. And as we go past this movie date, in which he describes, watching the movie and just being so nervous the entire time, she wears this hat for weeks and weeks on end. And I originally thought that, he complimented her. So she likes it. She likes that he complimented her and wants to keep wearing this hat. And of course, kids do what kids do. Kids are mean. They're awful. And a couple of boys in his grade, like to yank at the hat or jerk at it, just little snots. They're awful, And it all builds to a point where one day a kid goes to sharpen his pencil and he drops it on purpose and comes back up and he takes the cap off. And Brian reveals that Linda has a brain tumor. Her head is like just completely bald, skin stretched thinly over her skull. He said he could describe, even to this day, which he was like 9 when it happened, he was 40 when he wrote the story, he could describe the curvature of her skull and her veins bulging through her skin. So she has a brain tumor, and then she dies, like a year later. And Brian describes, kids are flexible. And really, trauma like that, it affects them differently than it does adults. Because he describes going to see the body. He goes to the visitation, and he feels a panic when he first walks up to the casket, which I can relate to. I remember when I was about his age when my grandmother died, and I went to her visitation, and felt the same sort of like guttural, animal-like panic. But when he gets up there, he sees her, and he thinks it's a joke, in only a way that a kid can. He thinks it's like a funny, because she looks like, and it's kind of I don't know if he does this on purpose, but he describes her as like she's bloated. Like, he for a second thought that they had made some awful tragic mistake and filled her with too much embalming fluid or something like that. But she, my understanding is the cancer no longer had gotten to her. Her skin wasn't stretched over her bones. But he said he thought that she was going to come out from behind, the casket or behind a floral arrangement and say, oh, it's just a joke. But then he leaves and he knows it's not a joke. But he sees her in his dreams. And he says that this was his first example in his life of storytelling helping him cope. Because he says whenever he went to sleep, he saw her and he talked to her. And she would say things like, do I look dead to you? Or, like they would quip and they would joke. And he would, he even started going to bed earlier and earlier and earlier as a way to, as to see her. And he didn't want to tell anybody because he described it as like a magician revealing his secrets and ruining the magic. But this is that story of Linda is the last part of the book. But I think it's a very interesting explanation to all of the other things he's done in the story, where he told the story about his squad mate Tim Lavender dying, or told the story about his friend Kiowa slipping into the mud in the poop in the field in Vietnam and dying. He, even as a child, used this storytelling as not only a release valve, but a way to keep those people alive. And he has a great reverence for the dead that he uses not only in his writing, but he describes it in his actions in Vietnam. Because to a certain extent, you have to dehumanize corpses, especially in wartime, or you will not make it. He describes one really, really awful example of a napalm strike that had hit a hospital. And a VC nurse was called like a fried critter. And then the scorched body of a baby that laid next to her was a crunchy munchie. Little awful things like that just you have to do. Or, you have to find some way to cope. It's gallows humor. But while his squad mates did things like that, or they would shake the hands of the dead, or throw like a can of oranges in their lap and say, oh, vitamin C, very important for a growing body. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't be so irreverent. And his one of his squad mates even applauds him for it. It's just how they function. He doesn't do anything like that. He describes one time he said it was the worst day of the war for him, where he had 3 hours of policing enemy KIA in the hot sun, and they had already decomposed for a day. And he just remembers crouching, by the bodies and looking at all of them and, kind of going through the same thought process he did when he killed that man on a trail, where he just thought, these were all people. They all had lives. They all had aspirations, kind of doing the opposite of the dehumanizing his squad mates do. And he describes them as bloated as well, which I thought was a very interesting comparison to use to not only his dead first love, but these dead enemy combatants. He described their clothes as stretched thin sausage casings. So I guess where I was going with that is just overall, I really, really enjoyed this story. I enjoyed the way that O'Brian used his storytelling not only as a vent for himself to vent his own trauma and frustration of Vietnam, but to write a very vivid and emotional story. He was just very good at details. I really, really enjoyed that. He was very good at what he did, and in the way that he described not only his squad mates, but, the people he killed or the people in his life. And I guess he does so good at that because that's his way of almost commemorating the dead. That's his way of preserving them. And he closes out the book with describing another dream he had with Linda. And I thought it was really poignant that he saw her and she said, what do I look like I'm dead? And then they went and skated on an ice lake all night. and he was a little kid at the start. He jumps up to skate, and he lands, and he's himself. In the blink of an eye, he goes from a 9-year-old boy to a 40-year-old man, and he realizes just as much as he's writing to save himself now from, the mental trauma, he's writing to save a previous version of his past self that didn't have all that baggage and had, the innocence of a child. And I thought that was a really poignant way to end the book. So overall, I really, really enjoyed The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I give it like a 9.5 out of 10 stars. I love the time period it's set in. I love the way he writes, and I love the way he closed out the story. It left me with a kind of an existential dread. I just really, really enjoyed it. He's a very solid author, and I would recommend anybody to read this book. Thank you.